The Crimson Apex War College maintained its reputation through a delicate balance of academic excellence and institutional arrogance that would have impressed even the most pretentious philosophy departments in the galaxy. Suspended in a stationary orbit above Centauri Prime, the massive orbital facility resembled a metallic flower blooming in the void. If flowers were designed by committee and cost approximately 17 billion credits to construct. Commander Thak-SOR clicked his mandibles in what passed for contemplation among the HFY species, though the sound more closely resembled someone attempting to crack particularly stubborn nuts with their face. His compound eyes swept across the assembled cadets in strategic combat theory, cataloging each species' natural advantages with a methodical precision that had made his people the galaxy's premier military contractors. The fact that they resembled oversized praying mantises in designer uniforms was, according to HFY philosophy, merely an unfortunate coincidence that had nothing whatsoever to do with their success rate. The classroom itself was a monument to modern educational technology, featuring holographic projectors that could simulate entire star systems and tactical displays capable of rendering battle scenarios in real-time three-dimensional glory. It also featured the sort of rigid seating arrangement that immediately communicated each species' position in the galactic pecking order, because apparently even in the 3rd to 4th century, some traditions died harder than diplomatic immunity violations. At the front of the class, occupying seats that practically radiated inherited privilege, sat the Valuian Empire's finest. Tall, naturally armored, and possessed of the sort of casual confidence that came from never having encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through superior firepower. They represented everything the galaxy had come to expect from a species that had conquered half their home cluster before achieving interstellar flight. Their leader, Prince Dex Morkan, lounged in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had never doubted his own superiority, largely because the universe had never given him reason to. Behind the Valorians, the Nexari technocrats hummed softly to themselves while interfacing directly with the classroom's data streams through neural implants that made their heads glow with a faint blue radiance. They had long ago abandoned the messy business of physical combat in favor of warfare conducted through economic manipulation and technological superiority, which was probably why their section of the classroom looked like a very expensive cybernetics convention. The middle rows housed representatives from a dozen other species, each maintaining their designated positions in the complex social hierarchy that governed interspecies relations. There were the crystalline Velthari, whose bodies refracted light in patterns that either represented deep philosophical concepts or elaborate mating displays, depending on who you asked. The amphibious Grexnari occupied specially designed moisture pods that kept their skin appropriately damp while allowing them to participate in classroom discussions without drowning. Various other species filled out the academic ecosystem, each bringing their own unique contributions to the grand experiment in galactic military education. And there, sitting roughly in the middle of the seating arrangement with the sort of careful neutrality that suggested either diplomatic training or a healthy survival instinct, was Cadet Ivy Blackwood. Human. The Academy's first exchange student from Earth's newly established Colonial Defense Academy, though most of her classmates treated her more like an interesting biological specimen than a legitimate military officer in training. Ivy possessed the sort of unremarkable appearance that humans seem to specialize in: average height, average build, average coloring that wouldn't have stood out in a crowd of other humans, let alone in a classroom full of beings who considered bioluminescence a basic communication tool. She took notes on an actual paper notebook, an affectation that her classmates found either charmingly primitive or mildly insulting, depending on their cultural background and personal tolerance for anachronisms. Today, Commander Thak-SOR announced, his translator converting his chittering vocalizations into standard galactic, we will examine the tactical doctrines of recently contacted species and their integration into modern military theory. A ripple of interest passed through the classroom, which was academic speak for let's all gawk at the primitive species and congratulate ourselves on our evolutionary superiority. Prince Dex raised one armored hand with the sort of casual authority that came from a lifetime of having people pay attention when he wanted to speak. Commander, I prepared a presentation on this very topic. Specifically, the combat methodologies of the human species and their limitations. Ivy looked up from her notebook, her expression shifting from polite attention to something that suggested she was recalculating the trajectory of her academic career in real time. Excellent initiative, Prince Morkan, Thak-SOR replied, his mandibles clicking in what might have been approval or the HFY equivalent of barely suppressed resignation. Please proceed. Dex rose from his seat with fluid grace, his natural armor catching the classroom's artificial lighting in ways that had probably been practiced in front of mirrors. The holographic projectors responded to his neural commands, filling the air above the students with three-dimensional displays of what appeared to be historical military engagements. As we can observe, Dex began, his voice carrying the sort of confident authority that came from never having been wrong about anything important. Human military doctrine represents a fascinating study in evolutionary compensation. Lacking natural weapons, armor, or any significant physical advantages, they have developed what can charitably be termed creative approaches to organized violence. The first holographic display showed ancient human warriors wielding primitive weapons, swords, spears, and what appeared to be metal clubs with excessive ornamentation. Several students tittered at the obviously crude technology, though Ivy's expression suggested she was taking careful notes of a different sort. Notice the reliance on external tools, Dex continued, gesturing at the display with the sort of academic authority typically reserved for tenured professors discussing their pet theories. Unable to evolve natural weapons, humans instead developed increasingly complex mechanical substitutes. Fascinating from an anthropological perspective, though hardly relevant to modern military science. The display shifted to show human military formations from various historical periods, phalanxes, cavalry charges, early gunpowder battles. To most of the class, it looked like an amusing historical curiosity, roughly equivalent to studying how their own species had organized before achieving civilization. Their tactical thinking, Dex explained, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had never met a topic he couldn't make about himself, relies heavily on overwhelming numerical superiority and brute force application. Crude, but effective in its primitive context. Ivy raised her hand with deliberate precision. Excuse me, Prince Morkan, but I believe there are some inaccuracies in your historical analysis. The classroom fell silent with the sort of sudden attention that preceded either academic breakthroughs or spectacular social disasters. Dex turned toward her with the expression of someone who had just been interrupted by a piece of furniture that had decided to offer its opinion on interior decoration. I beg your pardon. Dex's voice carried just enough politeness to avoid outright rudeness while making it clear that he considered her input roughly as valuable as background noise. Your presentation focuses exclusively on early human military history, Ivy replied, her tone maintaining the sort of respectful neutrality that suggested extensive diplomatic training. It omits several thousand years of tactical evolution, technological development, and strategic innovation. Such as. Dex's question carried the sort of casual dismissal typically reserved for discussing particularly unimpressive weather patterns. Ivy consulted her notebook with the deliberate precision of someone checking ammunition before a firefight. Well, for starters, your analysis of human formation tactics ignores the fact that phalanx warfare represented one of history's first systematic applications of unit cohesion and tactical discipline. The Roman legions that followed weren't just brute force. They were adaptive combined arms formations capable of adjusting their tactics based on terrain, enemy composition, and strategic objectives. Several students turned to stare at her with the sort of surprised attention typically reserved for discovering that houseplants had developed opinions about agricultural policy. Dex's expression shifted from dismissive amusement to something approaching irritation. Miss Blackwood, I hardly think ancient military formations are relevant to modern strategic thinking. Of course not, Ivy agreed pleasantly. That's why I mentioned tactical evolution. Human military doctrine continued developing. Combined arms coordination, asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, strategic deception, adaptive logistics. All compensations for biological inadequacy, Dex interrupted, his voice taking on the sort of edge that suggested his patience was approaching its operational limits. Clever workarounds, perhaps, but hardly comparable to species with natural military advantages. Such as the Valorians. Ivy inquired with the sort of innocent curiosity that experienced diplomats recognized as a warning sign. Exactly. Dex gestured to himself with the sort of casual pride that came from never having questioned whether his accomplishments were his own or his genetics. Natural armor, integrated weapon systems, enhanced reflexes, superior strength. We achieved military dominance through evolutionary advantage, not technological crutches. Interesting perspective, Ivy mused, making another note in her journal. And how well did those natural advantages serve your species during the Centauri Rebellion? The question landed in the classroom like a small explosive device with excellent timing. The Centauri Rebellion was a historical sore spot for the Valerian Empire, a 3-year conflict against a coalition of supposedly inferior species that had ended in a negotiated settlement that most military historians considered a polite way of describing a strategic draw. Dex's natural armor plates shifted in a pattern that suggested either deep thought or barely controlled homicidal rage. That conflict involved unique circumstances. Specifically, facing opponents who refused to engage in traditional warfare, Ivy continued with the relentless precision of someone presenting a carefully prepared academic argument. Enemies who used terrain, deception, mobility, and psychological warfare instead of meeting your forces in direct confrontation. Cowardly tactics, Dex replied, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Effective tactics, Ivy corrected gently. The sort of adaptive problem-solving that humans have been refining for millennia. Which brings us back to the question of whether biological advantages automatically translate to military superiority. Commander Thekesoa's mandibles clicked in a pattern that suggested he was either deeply fascinated or beginning to regret his career choices. An interesting theoretical discussion, he interjected, but perhaps we should focus on practical applications rather than historical debate. Actually, Dex said, his voice taking on the dangerous quietness that preceded either profound insights or spectacular mistakes, I think a practical demonstration would be far more educational than theoretical discussion. The suggestion hung in the air, like a challenge wrapped in academic language and seasoned with just enough arrogance to make it irresistible to anyone with a functioning sense of pride. Ivy looked up from her notebook, meeting Dex's gaze with an expression of polite interest that somehow managed to convey both respect and the quiet suggestion that he might want to think very carefully about his next words. "What sort of demonstration did you have in mind, Prince Morkan?" she asked with the sort of careful neutrality that suggested she already knew the answer and was giving him one last chance to reconsider. "A simple combat assessment," Dex replied, his confidence returning as he moved onto familiar territory. "Nothing dangerous, naturally. Just a practical comparison of natural military advantages versus adaptive techniques. For educational purposes." The office settled over the classroom like the sort of atmospheric pressure change that preceded either spectacular weather events or diplomatic incidents. Around the room, students leaned forward with the sort of predatory interest that suggested they were about to witness either a valuable learning experience or entertainment that would fuel gossip for the rest of the semester. And what would this demonstrate? Ivy inquired, closing her notebook with deliberate precision. The difference between evolved capability and learned compensation, Dex explained, already rising from his seat with the fluid confidence of someone who had never lost a fight he couldn't afford to lose. Superior genetics versus clever improvisation. "I see." Ivy stood as well, revealing a frame that was indeed smaller and less obviously dangerous than most of her classmates, though several students noted that she moved with the sort of economical grace that suggested extensive training in something other than academic theory. "And you believe this would be instructive?" "Immensely," Dex assured her, his natural weapons extending slightly in what was either an unconscious display of dominance or conscious intimidation. "Don't worry, I'll ensure the demonstration remains educational rather than humiliating." "How thoughtful," Ivy murmured, and there was something in her tone that made several students suddenly wonder if they should have paid more attention to the Academy's insurance policies. "When would you like to conduct this educational exercise?" "The tactical combat facility is available now," Dex replied, already moving toward the classroom exit with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested he was either very confident or very stupid. "We could record the session for future academic reference." "What a wonderful idea," Ivy said, gathering her belongings with the calm efficiency of someone who had just made a decision that would either advance a career or end it spectacularly. "Yes, I think that would be very educational indeed." Word of the impending demonstration spread through the orbital station's communication networks, with a sort of exponential velocity typically associated with either breaking news or malicious gossip. Within minutes, The tactical combat facility found itself hosting an audience that included not only Dex's original classmates but also cadets from other programs, several junior instructors, and at least one maintenance technician who had suddenly discovered urgent repairs that required his immediate presence in the observation deck. The facility itself was a testament to modern military engineering, adaptive environment simulators, real-time biometric monitoring, and weapons systems capable of delivering non-lethal, but thoroughly convincing combat experiences. It was also, as more than one cadet had discovered, equipped with recording systems sophisticated enough to capture every embarrassing moment in high-definition detail for posterity and disciplinary review. Prince Dex had changed into his formal combat attire, which consisted primarily of ceremonial armor that enhanced his natural protective plates while providing mounting points for various traditional weapons that looked both impressive and functional. He moved through a pre-combat ritual that involved a significant amount of posturing, threat display, and what could generously be described as interpretive dance with militaristic overtones. Ivy, by contrast, had simply removed her uniform jacket and checked her equipment with the sort of methodical attention typically associated with professional maintenance routines. Her preparation consisted mainly of stretching exercises and what appeared to be a careful examination of the facility's environmental controls, though why she found the atmosphere regulation system particularly interesting remained unclear. In the observation deck, betting pools had spontaneously formed using probability matrices so complex that they required advanced mathematics to understand and significant personal wealth to participate in meaningfully. The consensus among most species was that while the human might provide some entertainment value, the outcome was predetermined by simple biological reality. The Nexari had calculated odds of approximately 847 to 1 against human victory, though they hedged their analysis with footnotes about statistical anomalies and the unpredictable nature of adaptive behavior. The Velthari had composed what they claimed was a prophetic crystal formation predicting the battle's outcome, though it looked suspiciously like abstract art to anyone who hadn't spent decades studying crystalline philosophy. Various other species contributed their own cultural approaches to predictive analysis, creating a cacophony of academic speculation that would have impressed even the most ambitious gambling establishments. Commander Thak Sor observed from the facility's control station, his compound eyes tracking both combatants while his mandibles clicked in patterns that suggested either deep concern or morbid curiosity. As the supervising instructor, he had the authority to halt the exercise at any point, though he was beginning to suspect that stopping the demonstration might actually require more courage than allowing it to proceed. Combat parameters have been set to Academy standard non-lethal levels, he announced over the facility's communication system, his translated voice carrying throughout both the combat area and the observation deck. All weapon systems are configured for training mode. Medical systems are standing by. Begin when ready. Dex raised his arms in the traditional Valerian pre-combat salute, which involved displaying his natural weapons while issuing what the translators rendered as a formal challenge to honorable combat, though the actual phrasing contained several linguistic nuances that suggested his opponent's ancestry was both questionable and probably involved inappropriate relationships with farm equipment. Ivy responded with a simple nod that somehow managed to convey both respect for the formal nature of the occasion and a quiet confidence that suggested she had heard worse insults from more creative sources. Begin. The combat lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, according to the facility's precision chronometers, though the psychological impact extended considerably longer. Dex opened with the sort of devastating assault that had made the Valuian military famous across 17 star systems: explosive speed, overwhelming strength, and natural weapons deployed with the sort of tactical precision that came from millions of years of evolutionary refinement. His first charge covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds, his claws extended and his armored form radiating the sort of primal menace that had kept his species at the apex of their home planet's food chain. Ivy stepped sideways. It was a small movement, economical and precise, that somehow transformed Dex's impressive charge into an awkward stumble as he found himself attacking empty air, while his momentum carried him into the facility's padded wall. The impact was cushioned by safety systems, but the sound still resembled expensive equipment meeting immovable objects at inadvisable velocities. Interesting opening, Ivy commented conversationally as Dex extracted himself from the wall, with wounded dignity. Very traditional. Do all Valorians announce their attacks with quite so much ceremony, or is that a personal stylistic choice? Dex snarled, which was an impressive sound that contained harmonics of barely contained violence and overtones of injured pride. Lucky dodge, he growled, circling her with renewed caution. Let's see how many more you have. Oh, I've barely gotten started, Ivy replied, and several observers noted that her tone suggested she was enjoying herself in ways that probably violated several Academy regulations regarding appropriate competitive spirit. The second attack sequence was more measured, a series of coordinated strikes designed to limit Ivy's mobility while systematically overwhelming her defenses. It was textbook Valerian combat doctrine, straight from the most prestigious military academies in the Empire, and it should have ended the demonstration within 30 seconds. Instead, Ivy seemed to flow around the attacks like water navigating obstacles, each dodge calculated to place her exactly where Dex's next strike would be least effective. She didn't just avoid his attacks. She made them work against him, using his own momentum and aggressive positioning to keep him off balance while gradually wearing down his stamina. You know what's fascinating about natural predators? Ivy asked as she ducked under a particularly vicious swipe that left gouges in the facility's reinforced wall. They tend to develop what biologists call apex predator syndrome. When you're at the top of the food chain for long enough, you forget what it feels like to face genuine opposition. Silence. Dex lunged again, this time abandoning tactical precision in favor of raw aggression. His claws whistled through the air in patterns that would have been devastatingly effective against any conventional opponent. Ivy wasn't conventional. See, that's the thing about humans, she continued, weaving between strikes with a sort of casual grace that suggested this was merely a warm-up exercise. We were never apex predators. We were persistence hunters. Do you know what that means? A particularly ambitious attack came close enough to part her hair, but Ivy's response was to grab Dex's extended arm and use his own strength against him, redirecting his momentum to send him stumbling across the combat area in a direction he hadn't intended to travel. It means we specialize in wearing down prey that's bigger, stronger, and better armed than we are, she explained as Dex fought to regain his footing. We don't rely on overwhelming initial attacks. We rely on outlasting our opponents until their natural advantages become liabilities. The observation deck had fallen silent as the implications of what they were witnessing began to penetrate even the most optimistically biased predictions. This wasn't a demonstration of superior genetics overwhelming inferior adaptation. This was a masterclass in tactical psychology delivered by someone who understood exactly how to turn natural advantages into exploitable weaknesses. Your species combat doctrine, Ivy continued, now moving with predatory confidence while Dex showed the first signs of fatigue, assumes your opponents will either flee in terror or stand still while you demonstrate your superior firepower. But what happens when you face an opponent who does neither? Dex's response was a roar of frustration that echoed through the facility's sound systems, followed by a final desperate assault that committed every resource he possessed to overwhelming his apparently fragile human opponent through sheer force of genetic superiority. Ivy waited until the last possible moment, then stepped inside his guard with movements so economical it barely registered on the facility's motion sensors. What happened next unfolded with the sort of inevitable precision that characterized either perfectly executed military maneuvers or very expensive accidents. Using a combination of leverage, momentum, and what could only be described as applied physics, she turned Dex's final charge into a demonstration of how Valerian natural armor interacted with Academy safety padding when introduced at high velocity and awkward angles. The resulting impact was cushioned enough to prevent serious injury, but loud enough to be heard throughout the observation deck. Prince Dex Morkan, heir to one of the galaxy's most militarily prestigious bloodlines, found himself flat on his back in the center of the combat area, staring at the ceiling while trying to process how his genetically guaranteed victory had somehow transformed into comprehensive defeat. And that, Ivy said, not even breathing hard despite having just systematically dismantled someone twice his size and considerably better armed, is why humans stopped being prey species about 50,000 years ago. We learned that the best way to deal with natural predators is to make them exhaust themselves while we figure out their weaknesses. She looked around the combat area, taking in the stunned faces pressed against the observation windows. Your mistake wasn't underestimating human capabilities. It was assuming that evolutionary advantages automatically translate to tactical superiority. They don't. They just create different types of problems to solve. Commander Thekesoa's voice crackled over the communication system, carrying a tone of professional interest that couldn't quite hide his amazement. Miss Blackwood, that was most educational. Perhaps you could elaborate on the specific techniques you employed. Ivy's smile took on qualities that suggested depths better left unexplored by those who valued their peace of mind. I'd be happy to discuss human combat methodology, Commander. Though you might want to review the unclassified sections of our military history first. It provides useful context. As the facility's medical systems conducted their routine post-combat assessment, Dex was physically uninjured, but suffering from what the diagnostic equipment diplomatically described as acute psychological readjustment syndrome. Ivy gathered her belongings with the calm efficiency of someone whose day had proceeded exactly according to plan. Walking past the still-prone Valerian prince, she paused just long enough to offer a final observation. For what it's worth, your natural advantages are genuinely impressive. But advantages are only useful if you know how to deploy them against opponents who refuse to cooperate with your assumptions about how combat should work. She headed toward the facility exit, leaving behind a room full of cadets whose understanding of military hierarchy had just been thoroughly and very publicly recalibrated. The irony, of course, was that Commander Thekesoa had been absolutely correct about one thing. The demonstration had indeed been highly educational. Just not quite in the way anyone had anticipated. The Crimson Apex War College learned several important lessons that day about the difference between genetic gifts and earned capabilities. But perhaps the most valuable lesson was simpler. Never underestimate a species that had to fight for every advantage it achieved, because anything that had to earn its position at the top of the food chain was probably still fighting for very good reasons. After all, persistence hunters were called that for a reason.